I do most of my gardening in raised beds, far beyond just my vegetable gardening. I have wooden raised beds, I have concrete block raised beds, I have metal raised beds, I have raised beds of all different types, because when it comes to raised garden bed design, there's no single recommendation as to which one is best for every garden. Join me today as I show you the examples of the many raised beds I have throughout my garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and when it comes to raised beds, what many gardeners think of is a section like this in my garden, the elevated wooden boxes that we grow our vegetables in. And while these are the classic design for raised beds, there are many other options in our garden. Metal raised beds like this one are becoming increasingly popular among gardeners, and I'm adding more of them every year. The height is good, the strength is good, they last for probably as long as you're going to be gardening, and there's a lot of flexibility in how you design your garden bed, the shape you have, because this modular steel system allows you to put them together in a number of different shapes. That other metal bed is 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. This one is 3 feet wide and 9 feet long. I'm planning on growing similar plants from one year to the next in the beds, but having the ability to modify the shape and fit it into your garden design really is a nice option to have with these modular steel systems. Those other metal beds are 17 inches tall, which for me is an ideal height because I like to get down and kneel next to my beds as I'm working with the plants. This one is my biggest raised bed. It stands 32 inches tall. And once I get this filled and start growing in it, I barely need to bend over at all. A bed of this design may be ideal for someone with mobility issues who can't get down on the ground and prefers to garden standing up. The manufactured metal raised beds give a lot of options when it comes to garden design and the practicality of the raised beds you use. But by definition, a raised bed is nothing more than a bed that is higher than the ground around it. And at the other end of the spectrum is this raised bed right here. It's a mounded area that I have bordered by tree branches. It cost me nothing, but it is still a raised bed. It still has a design element, and it still has a place in a garden. I use the same basic approach in this raised bed for my raspberries, using bigger branches closer to logs to raise up the level of the soil. Now, one of the biggest advantages I find to raised bed gardening is that you can fill the bed with better soil than you have naturally outside the bed. And that's what I've done with all of these raised beds. The soil inside is better than my native soil. And while this bed is only about 4 inches higher than the surrounding ground, all of the soil in here has been amended. And I use mulch as I grow these plants. So the soil is better inside than outside. And the only difference is this log that helps identify that change in height and the nutrition value of the soil. There's no rule that defines how big a raised bed should be. This entire area has the logs around it, so I consider this whole space a large raised bed. Within this space, I have a smaller raised bed that's ringed by these stones. In here, I have stinging nettle. I want to keep it separate from all the other plants. So I have a larger raised area, and then I have a smaller round area that still classifies as a raised bed. In fact, this whole area of my garden is just a series of different raised beds, different shapes, different sizes, and different materials. I used lumber to construct all of the beds in this section, starting with this asparagus bed. I used 2x8s to form this bed 3 feet wide and 9 feet long. The soil in here rests about 7 inches higher than the outside soil. This inner section, which is 7 feet by 9 feet long, is made with 4x6 lumber, much sturdier, but the soil here is only about 5 inches higher than the remaining ground. And remember, all this soil is amended. I dug out underneath this bed before I put the asparagus roots in, so the roots do go quite a bit deeper than this bed, but this just helps define the space. I have perennial plants growing in this bed. I've got my comfrey and my currants, and this is an area, again, defined by the edges of the raised bed with better soil on the inside. I have a pair of raised beds to support this garden archway. These beds are made with 4x4 lumber, and they sit about 18 inches high. They're 3 feet wide and 9 feet long. To balance the design of this section of my garden, I repeated the same beds on this end. This is a 7 by 9 foot bed framed by 4x6 lumber, and this is 2x8 lumber for an asparagus bed. Again, I've got perennial plants in this section. I've got my comfrey, my rhubarb, my gooseberries, and so this whole section ties together as basically one series of beds, even though they're different heights and different shapes. To anchor the end of this section, I have these 2 metal raised beds. These are just animal watering troughs. I drilled holes in the bottom and painted them, and now they're raised beds for other perennials. This is horseradish and chives in this one, and I've got mint in this one. Those are plants I don't want to escape into my garden. These also, as raised beds, help define the space behind them. So I've got another currant bush and salvias, and as you might guess, the soil between that wooden raised bed and this metal raised bed is raised, creating another raised bed area, even though it doesn't have a defined border. To counter the visual of all of this horizontal wood in these beds, I went ahead and surrounded this raised herb garden with vertical boards. It helps me reuse some of the wood I have in my garden. It also ties in with the wood border on the other side. This bed is about 4 inches higher than the surrounding ground. This is another way to make a raised bed. I built this area of galvanized steel raised beds with a couple different ideas in mind. First off, it's a very practical area for gardening. These beds sit 22 inches high, which makes it easy for me to sit on as I garden or to easily kneel in front of. I like the use of both the wood and the metal to tie in a lot of the other beds that I have in my garden space. And this steel can be expected to last longer than the wood. So I shouldn't have to replace the components in these metal raised beds anytime soon. Another type of bed that will last for as long as I continue to garden is this concrete block bed. It rests about 8 inches higher than the surrounding ground, and this concrete block is not going to break down. I'm not going to need to replace these pieces at all. And this type of raised bed actually gives me another advantage. I can grow inside the holes of these concrete blocks. The tour of my garden with all of these different types of raised beds brings us back to these, the wooden ones. These were the first type of raised beds that I grew in, and these are the type of raised beds that many gardeners grow in for the first time. It's different type of lumber from 2x8s to 2x12, so the height will vary from about 15 inches to about 18 inches tall. That's perfect for me. That's why all of these are double height. I could just as easily make them a lower height as with some of those other lower wooden raised beds. But you may notice that those other beds are primarily perennial plants, the kinds that I don't need to get down and work with on a regular basis. For my vegetable garden, the kind that I am working with on a regular basis, I have to watch my back. I can't get down and get up as well as I used to. So these are the beds I prefer. You've seen that raised beds can come in all sizes and shapes. Mine tend to be rectangular because that's an easy shape to cut a board and fashion a raised bed into. But like the stone, I have circular beds, and with these metal, I have oval raised beds. Whatever type of gardening you're doing, chances are you can find a raised bed to fit that type of gardening. And to see how I do some of my raised bed gardening, watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.